It's a little difficult, I know, for people, the people I'm speaking to virtually, because I am going to read and look at the audience here, and I'm supposed to be looking at the camera as well, and I find that a little challenging. But in any case, I'll just do my best. I'm going to read a paper. So my title, as you know, is Re-envisioning Freedom, Ethical and Political Agency in Our Times of Ecological Disaster. For a number of years, I've been concerned to reimagine and re-articulate the concept of freedom as a mode of ethically self-determining human agency in a democratic political context. In these reflections, my focus has been on self-determining agency as a distinctive form of social freedom in the general sense of dependent on human relations within society. Recently, however, I've come to realize that this perspective is too narrow. In my current work, I expand my gaze, now situating self-determining human agency within a larger frame in the context of the contemporary ecological disaster. The thesis driving my new endeavour is that the contemporary ecological disaster calls for a radical reconceptualization of human freedom as it has been understood by modern Western political thinking and embodied in everyday thought, behaviour and social practices. Following Horkheimer and Adorno, my starting position is that within capitalist modernity, the ideal of freedom has been based on a view of human agency that expresses an attitude of manipulation and control. This view of agency, which has been internalized in socialization processes in Western culture, has contributed significantly to ecological devastation globally. In response, I seek to re-envision freedom as a mode of ethically self-determining, self-transforming human agency that has a transformative political potential. Just give me a minute. Put differently, I want to show the importance at certain times in history of radically reimagining what it means to lead an ethically good life and the need for new ethical vocabularies to accompany such reimaginings. Thus, the bigger project of which this paper is part aims to offer a vision of human agency and the terms in which to articulate it that would empower humans to fundamentally reorient their everyday thinking, behaviour and social practices. It's a project in a literal sense, endeavouring to create a new field of possibilities amidst the current dire circumstances, in a context where it may seem impossible even to imagine what these new possibilities might be. In recent times, the term the Anthropocene has gained widespread currency in popular and academic discourse to describe the anthropogenic aspect of the contemporary ecological disaster. It's now widely used as a name for a new epoch of human evolution, characterized by human-induced change to the biosphere, and also to convey the unprecedented rapidity and unparalleled capacity of humans to destroy the ecosystems on which their survival depends. Despite disputes among geologists concerning the degree to which the present period can be identified as a successor epoch to the Holocene, there's overwhelming scientific agreement that rapid anthropogenic climate change and loss of biodiversity constitute grave threats to the future of the human species. Indeed, there's widespread scientific agreement that human activity, amplified by the rapid development of capitalist industrialization and the unchecked pursuit of affluence, has unleashed uncontrollable natural forces that leave contemporary humans as vulnerable to the devastating power of nature as their earlier ancestors. There are strong reasons to think that the predominant conceptions of human agency, particularly within modern Western culture, have both facilitated this anthropogenic environmental devastation and inhibited our potential, our ability as humans to break free from our current disastrous trajectory. Here I connect with recent thinkings in Earth system science, where conceptions of human agency and political freedom have come to be seen as part of a larger interconnected biosphere. Scientists, recognizing conceptions of human agency and freedom as a significant factor in anthropogenic climate change and loss of biodiversity, now advise scholars and researchers from the humanities and social sciences to help them address the challenges of ecological disaster. Following this line of thought, revolutionary breakthroughs in geoengineering and carbon dioxide removal are unlikely to be sufficient to halt humanity's perilous trajectory and redirect it for the better. Rather, technological advances will need to be accompanied by a new perspective on human agency at an individual and collective level, which breaks decisively with a view of non-human entities as primarily objects for manipulation and control. Since it was first coined, use of the Anthropocene concept to characterize the contemporary global ecological situation has attracted criticism in the humanities and social sciences, particularly among theorists concerned with radical social transformation. Their criticisms are directed primarily at implicit assumptions about human nature and socio-political relations that are characteristic of some prominent interpretations of the Anthropocene concept. The main objections are that the concept of the Anthropocene naturalizes, depoliticizes, and conceals. It naturalizes the ecological disaster by rendering it a natural outcome of the sort of species that humans are. It depoliticizes by flattening social, political, and economic relations, grouping together all humans under one umbrella, implying that no particular group of humans is to blame. It depoliticizes further due to its implicit message that little can be done to avert disaster. It conceals factors important to understanding the ecological crisis, such as economic inequalities, cultural asymmetries, colonialism, mass media, and social media, thereby distracting from their role in the crisis and hindering reflection on how to address these problems and the ecological iniquities with which they are intimately connected. Critically engaged theorists who take this critical stance towards the concept of the Anthropocene propose alternative framing concepts by means of which they attempt to reveal and capture the central components the Anthropocene concept neglects or obscures. Influential alternative proposals include Capitalocene, Plantationocene, Urbanocene, and there are others. I view these not as rival concepts, but as narratives driven by shared concern. I take seriously the dangers to which critics draw attention, while nonetheless insisting that ecological devastation is a larger context within which challenges posed by capitalism, colonialism, and urban expansion must be addressed. The COVID-19 pandemic is a grim reminder of the hubristic attitude expressed in the modern ideal of freedom. Despite enormous scientific achievements that led to the production of new vaccines in a remarkably short time, the pandemic has shaken confidence in the view that technological ingenuity can master nature and finally put an end to virulent disease. The increasing frequency and violence of flash floods, wildfires, and heat waves has further contributed to a growing perception of human vulnerabilities to natural forces. However, the new humility is ambivalent. On the positive side, it offers the prospect of a fundamental change in thinking about human agency in its relation to self and others, human and non-humans. On the negative side, it's frequently coupled with feelings of human powerlessness that are expressed, for example, in blustering defiance, that's libertarianism, or violence, eco-terrorism, or resignation, which is probably most of us ordinary citizens of contemporary Western democracies. Such responses threaten to perpetuate the patterns of thought and behavior that led to ecological devastation in the first place. And that's one reason not to jettison the concept of freedom entirely, but to seek instead to reconceptualize it. For lacking a sense that self-determining agency is possible, humans are all too likely to succumb to these kinds of destructive and regressive feelings of powerlessness, and to the delusional belief in human supremacy, which they often go hand in hand. But there's a deeper reason why I consider it important to retain the idea of freedom, despite its troubling history within capitalist modernity. I hold that the concept of freedom, if reimagined and rearticulated in the right way, is indispensable for socially and political transformative agency. Moreover, since social change for the better is a never-ending process, I see freedom as necessary not only in order to achieve a better society on a once-off basis, but as an indispensable element of any good society. However, as mentioned, I agree with Horkheimer and Adorno that the ideal of individual freedom characteristic of capitalist modernity expresses an attitude of manipulation and control. Whether it's understood negatively as freedom from external interference, or positively as self-determination or self-legislation, the mainstream modern ideal of liberty is undergirded by the conviction that human freedom entails absolute sovereignty, the possession and exercise of a will that chooses and determines just as it pleases. Intimately connected with a belief in the limitless potential of human agency, this ideal has assumed a plenitude of inexhaustible resources, enabling an ever-expanding range of human choices, self-gratifying consumption, and uninhibited self-expression. This is why I argue that freedom has to be reimagined and rearticulated. My expanded perspective on human freedom conceives of it as, I have to put this in inverted commas, it's not a wonderful term, but I can't come up with it better. It conceives of human freedom as ecologically attuned, transformative, ethically self-determining agency. By ecologically attuned, I mean agency that relates in an ethically non-hierarchical way to other humans, non-humans. I argue that this calls for human relationships oriented by ideas of the good that conceive of the good as inherently transcending of human conceptualizations of it. In the following, I will attempt to give you a better sense of my still sketchy idea. Recently, there have been a number of interesting attempts within political philosophy to move beyond a crude distinction between negative and positive liberty, and in particular to rethink the idea of positive freedom in social relational terms. In line with this development, I construe ethical self-determination as a form of social freedom in the sense that it's a kind of freedom that's available only in a social context through relationships with others. However, there are many different ways in which social freedom can be understood. In my work over the past years, I have elaborated a distinctive conception of social freedom that ties it to a critically reflective concern for the good, whereby the shape and content of the good has been left open. In my new undertaking, my new project, I issue an invitation to imagine the shape and content of this critically reflective concern for the good in a specific way. In my efforts to re-envision freedom in the context of ecological disaster, I invite us to imagine its ethical component, the concern for the good, as an ecologically attuned concern for the good, a concern driving human agents who relate in an ethically non-hierarchical way to others, human and non-human. In other words, the good is now imagined as a rationally supported projection of how human and non-human entities should dwell together on Earth on an ethically equal footing. In this imagining of the good is not determined exclusively by human interests and concerns, but it's a good for every entity, human and non-human. Importantly, claims to the validity of human ideas of the good, which are likely always to be multiple and conflicting, are treated as human transcending in a double sense. First, in the sense of universal in scope, for they encompass non-human and human concerns and interests, and second, in the sense of truth analogous, for their validity is deemed to be inherently transcending of human reasoning, though nonetheless dependent on it. My claim here is that human reasoning is necessary in order to evaluate claims to validity, and that evaluation is in turn indispensable for the purposes of social and political critique. This is because there is no single conception of the good that would once and for all guarantee ethically good lives for all human and non-human entities. Similarly, there's no single form of politics that would finally constitute a good society. In elaborating, or in my attempts to elaborate, my incipient attempts to elaborate the idea of an ecologically attuned ethical perspective, my broader project will engage with non-Western thinking about agency, taking North American indigenous thinking as its principal interlocutor. This restricted focus, this expanded yet restricted focus, is partly because North American indigenous thinking has developed an exemplarily well-developed body of thinking about agency, and also because it's a philosophical tradition which uniquely combines a critique of Western settler colonialism with an idea of agency, sometimes expressed by the concept of earth-boundedness, that seems, at least to me initially, seems close to my ecologically attuned conception. My hypothesis is that indigenous theory and practice offers a model of non-instrumental relations between human and non-human agents that resists the supremacist logic characteristic of human practices within capitalist modernity. That is to say, my hypothesis is that attentiveness to indigenous traditional thinking and practice can help to expand, enrich, and critically interrogate modern Western conceptions of human agency due to indigenous insistence upon the ethical agency of non-human entities and insistence on the importance of land in centering communal ties. This insistence comes coupled with a demand for recognition of the associative obligations that humans have to the natural world whenever they make use of it for their own purposes. My overall aim in this part of the project is to explore ways in which indigenous thinking and practice constitute a genuine alternative to the supremacist logic of Western modernity. I'm going to attempt to explore this by addressing various clusters of questions. These include questions about how indigenous thinking about political agency comports with Western conceptions of self-determination and self-transformation, whether indigenous thinking attributes to human agency an ethical moment that can be described as a concern for the good, human or non-human, and how, if at all, it expresses and anticipates what I've called an ecologically attuned attitude or perspective. Ecological attunement, with its ethically non-hierarchical perspective and the orientation towards a human transcending idea of the good required for this, is one key feature of my proposed reimagining freedom. A further key feature is critically engaged self-direction. In elaborating this idea, I draw on Marx's writings on alienation in his 1844 economic and philosophical manuscripts. As is well known, Marx describes three forms of alienation in these early writings: alienation of humans from their work or labor, understood as freely purposive creative activity; alienation of humans from the products of their activity; and alienation of humans from their species being. By alienation of humans from their species being, I understand him to mean alienation of humans from their capacity for freely purposive, creative, self-reflective activity. As I read the early Marx, he understands freedom not only as the capacity of humans to set goals and pursue them without being bound by biological necessity, as he writes, the capacity to create according to the laws of beauty. Marx also understands freedom as the capacity of humans to make their life activity into the object of their will and consciousness. Free conscious activity is, as he puts it, the species character of man. And this is why alienated labor alienates the species from man. However, Marx doesn't, in my view, satisfactorily develop this thought in his early manuscripts. Charles Taylor's view of the modern self as a strong evaluator can help to explicate it. Taylor holds that humans are self-interpreting creatures. By this he means that human relationships to the world are never simply given, but are constantly articulated, reconstituted, negotiated, and transformed through individual and cultural processes of interpretation. Furthermore, human interpretations of the world are always also an interpretation of self, and vice versa. The process of self-interpretation is driven by what Taylor calls strong evaluations. At any given time, these strong evaluations constitute evaluative roadmaps for human individuals. Stable identities and methodical human action are inconceivable without such roadmaps, which depict substantial ethical conceptions embodying ideas of the good, ideas about what's important, what really matters. In other words, the good is that which is picked out as incomparably higher in a qualitative distinction. And in this sense, it's a higher good. Higher goods depend in turn on constitutive goods. Examples that Taylor gives of constitutive goods include God, history, reason, art, nature. Such goods command moral allegiance and as such are what Taylor calls moral sources. Accordingly, strong evaluation has an integral receptive element, calling for openness to experiences in which the power of moral sources makes itself present in a full-bodied way to human subjects, requiring in turn flexibility, open-mindedness, sensitivity to others, and imaginativeness. Nonetheless, strong evaluation is also a mode of self-determination. This is because it requires human agents to ascertain for themselves what kind of person they would like to be and what paths they should pursue if they are to become that kind of person. Furthermore, it requires them to take responsibility for their evaluative judgments. In addition, it has a crucial moment of critical evaluation. Self-determination calls for strong evaluation calls for evaluative discrimination by human agents among the aims in life they consider worth pursuing. Put differently, strong evaluation calls for critical evaluation by human agents of the ethical quality of their actions, judgments, and life trajectories. In sum, strong evaluation requires a critical reflective concern for an ethically good life. To be sure, while strong evaluation presupposes an orientation towards good, it leaves open the question of whether this orientation should be or is ecologically attuned. Nor does it necessarily involve self-transformation. Thus, in conceptualizing or attempting to reconceptualize freedom as ecologically attuned, self-determining, and self-transforming agency, I moved beyond Taylor's conception of strong evaluation. But why, you may ask, why self-transformation? Without a self-transforming component, freedom could not be construed as potentially transformative of society. Due to internalized patterns of thought and behavior, even critically engaged self-determining human agency might simply reproduce the socially prevailing patterns. This difficulty recalls the conception of ideology developed by Frankfurt School critical theorists. Early theorists in this tradition proposed an understanding of ideology as structurally induced, deeply entrenched, widespread false consciousness that prevents human agents, individually and collectively, from perceiving the need for fundamental social change and grasping the kind of change that's necessary. This helps to explain why even in societies in which, like ours, in which many people pay lip service to the reality of ecological disaster, everyday practices continue to rely heavily on the appropriation of natural resources that are treated as unlimited. However, despite its helpfulness, early Frankfurt School critical theory's conception of ideology as false consciousness harbors at least two serious dangers. One is the view that under conditions of advanced capitalism, ideology has become an all-encompassing and impenetrable system that is virtually unbreachable. This threatens to extinguish completely the power of critically engaged theories to disclose possibilities for better forms of individual and social life. On some readings, such as Habermas's, Horkheimer and Adorno's dialectic of enlightenment falls prey to this danger. However, Adorno's later writings offer a less gloomy diagnosis of false consciousness within advanced capitalism. While continuing to stress difficulties facing efforts to achieve fundamental social transformation, on occasion, Adorno's later writings propose concrete ways of changing collective consciousness and behavior, for example, through education. A second danger with the early Frankfurt School theory conception of ideology as false consciousness is a too hasty theoretical leap from the thesis of structurally induced, deeply entrenched, widespread false consciousness to the position that radical social change demands a fundamental breach with the existing socio-economic political order. This position leads easily to the theoretically and politically authoritarian claim that only large-scale political revolutions directed by strong leaders who have the correct grasp of what is to be done and are convinced of the truth of their revolutionary beliefs can bring about fundamental social transformation. Theoretical and political authoritarianism is evidently hostile to ethically self-determining agency, as I have presented it. Furthermore, it doesn't fit well with the ethically non-hierarchical, ecologically attuned perspective that I'm proposing. For these reasons, I seek to identify possibilities for non-authoritarian transformation of consciousness. I find the writings of Adorno, despite a certain ambivalence, helpful in this respect. To begin with, they suggest a view of revolutionary change as incremental and piecemeal, rather than as radical rupture. This rejection of change as radical rupture is evident, for example, in Adorno's insightful criticisms of the actionism, what he calls the actionism, of student revolutionaries in the late 1960s. Adorno comments bitingly on the futile efforts of the student activists to rescue enclaves of spontaneity within a thoroughly mediated and rigidified society, and criticizes their self-delusion that their disruptive actions are inherently socially transformative. And there are productive intersections here, I think, between Adorno's criticisms of actionism and the later writings of Michel Foucault, in which he too advocates fundamental social transformation by way of incremental and piecemeal changes. Social transformation. So one reason why social transformation in my project is tied to self-transformation has to do with the problem of false consciousness, put simply and a bit crudely. But it's also tied, there's also a further reason why self-transformation is tied to, social transformation is tied to self-transformation. There's a strong likelihood that self-transformation will be necessary, widespread self-transformation will be necessary to actualize, to concretize the proposed vision of agency. This is because the currently globally dominant patterns of everyday behavior and social practice are based on a logic of manipulation and control that is antithetical to an ecologically attuned, ethically self-determined agency. Consequently, actualizing the vision I'm proposing will require widespread fundamental self-transformation if it's to become part of habitual behavior and practice on both individual and collective levels globally. My project will or seeks to address the question of self-transformation through exploration of aesthetics. One of the distinctive features of Frankfurt School critical theory is its connection of the question of social change for the better with art. And indigenous thinking, too, in ways I intend to explore further, maintains the philosophical and social centrality of aesthetics. However, I want to elaborate a new, or at least different, understanding of aesthetics. Rather than adopting a Kantian interpretation of aesthetics as appreciation of beauty, I seek, or I want to retrieve and re-articulate the ancient Greek understanding of aesthesis as responsiveness to stimulation of the senses as some kind of sensibility. And here I take aesthesis, because my suggestion is that we should understand aesthesis as affectively based perceptual change. This re-articulated conception of aesthetics would provide the basis for an account of the non-authoritarian transformative potentials of aesthetic practices and experiences. But I also want to widen the scope of aesthetics to include practices and experiences beyond the domain of aesthetics as it has been institutionalized in modern Western traditions. My aim is to show, for example, how marginal and experimental forms of life practices can have an aesthetic dimension, containing potentials for transforming self-understandings. I will focus my project on ecologically motivated, unorthodox forms of life, such as off-grid living, but there are others, seeking to show how these might contribute to changing perceptions, habits, and practices in ways that foster ethically self-determining agency, as well as ecologically attuned ethical relations. At the same time, I want to consider artworks and art practices within the domain of institutionalized art, showing how these too may contribute to changing perceptions, habits, and social practices in the desired ways. In the concluding parts of my paper, I want, for the purposes of illustration, I want briefly to contrast my proposed, my sketched conceptualization of freedom with two provocative recent contributions to discussions of human agency that at first glance seem very close to my own concerns. However, I want to say that they differ from my proposal in crucial and, I hope, illuminating respects. The first provocative rethinking or reconceptualization of human freedom is the imagining of freedom as resonant, self-efficacious subjectivity that has been offered by Hartmut Rosa in his 2015 book Resonance. It came out in English in 2019. It was published in German in 2015. And the second is a reimagining of freedom as idleness. So one as resonance and one as idleness that is offered by my colleague in Dublin, Brian O'Connor, in his recent philosophical essay, Idleness. So I think Hartmut Rosa's conception of subjectivity of freedom as resonance is particularly helpful because it's helpful to explain why I attach so much importance to the idea of self-determination or self-direction, because that aspect is missing from Rosa's conception of agency or freedom, in fact, as idleness. Some of you will know, but I'm sure not everybody, resonance is the key category in Rosa's most recent contribution to critical social theory. His book, Resonance, is explicitly a contribution to critical social theory, and he presents it as a critique of alienated subjectivity. So he's very much trying to continue the tradition of Frankfurt critical theory by offering a critique of alienation in terms of resonant subjectivity. His normative claim in that book is that humans are existentially shaped by their longing for resonant relationships. And here he employs the concept of resonance as a meta-criterion, as the measure of a good life, in the ethical sense of a well-lived one. On occasion, Rosa makes clear that he views resonance as the modern promise of freedom. He characterizes the project of European modernity as a dialectical movement between desire for mastery of the world and desire for resonance through what he calls adaptive transformation of the world. By this he means adaptive transformation of the world. The German word is Anverwandlung. By this he means the desire to go out into the world to find that place that speaks to us or appeals to us, where we can feel at home, that we can make our own. Satisfying this desire for resonance, for adaptive transformation of the world, is, he claims, the promise inherent in the modern idea of freedom. He then unpacks the idea of freedom in terms of a resonant mode of what he calls self-efficacious subjectivity. And I find much to commend in his approach. However, I want to say that he underplays a component that historically has been central for critique of alienation. And this is Marx's idea of freedom as self-conscious, freely purposive activity. Rosa passes over the importance for Marx's analysis of self-reflective he passes over the importance for Marx's analysis of alienation of self-reflective creative activity, and hence he passes over too quickly. He passes over the importance for Marx of freedom as a form of self-determination. For Rosa, resonance describes a mode of being in the world, a specific way in which human subjects and various segments of the world enter into relationships with one another. The core idea is that human subjects, have a need and desire mutually to interact with each other and with their social, material, and natural environments in such a way that each can be understood as responding to the other, while at the same time speaking with its own voice. And this is what he means by adaptive transformation, a continuous process of change through reciprocal responsiveness. Rosa uses the example of two tuning forks to illustrate what he means by resonant relationships or adaptive transformation. When placed in close proximity, the vibration of one tuning fork prompts the other to vibrate at its own frequency. Each then speaks in its own voice. Moreover, the vibrations of the two forks can mutually reinforce each other, their amplitudes growing ever larger. For Rosa, the interactive aspect of the tuning fork metaphor is crucial. He observes correctly, in my view, that being in the world is always relational. He agrees, moreover, with authors such as Rahel Yegi that alienation is a state in which subjects have relationships. The point is that they come to see their relationships as meaningless, becoming indifferent to or even repulsed by them. As Rosa puts it, alienated subjects encounter a mute world, a world that doesn't sing back to them, a world bereft of qualities. In their state of alienation, only kinds of relationships in the world available to them are either withdrawal from or instrumentalizing control over the segment of the world in question. The tuning fork metaphor is interesting from the point of view of my own idea of freedom as ecologically attuned, ethical self-determination. Certainly, Rosa and I share a critical gaze on instrumentalizing and controlling human agency. The difference, as we now see, is that Rosa vehemently rejects any attempt to conceptualize freedom in terms of autonomy or self-determination. He argues that the non-relational character of the concept of autonomy makes it unsuitable for defining resonant subjectivity, insisting that non-relationality is part of the very concept of autonomy or self-determination, because autonomy requires self, autos, to be governed by a law, nomus. Rosa's critical observations on the concept of autonomy reiterate worries about autonomy's connotations of self-ownership and self-sufficiency that have been articulated in various ways since Kant. Reinforced by Nietzsche's and Foucault's suspicion of autonomy as a normative ideal, these objections were picked up and developed by multiple communitarian, feminist, and post-structural critics in the 1980s and 90s. Furthermore, in common with early Frankfurt School critical theorists, in particular Horkheimer and Adorno, Rosa emphasizes the connection between autonomous agency and capitalism. He shares Horkheimer and Adorno's view that a self-determining subject is a functional prerequisite for the institutions of capitalist modernity. He also agrees with them that the principle of self-determination supports the logic of capitalist competition. Finally, he agrees with Horkheimer and Adorno's thesis that modernity's valorization of autonomy has gone hand in hand with a picture of atomized, relationless subjects defined by an instrumentalizing relationship to the world, which is a basis for a capitalist economy of technological and scientific rationality. This leads him to endorse Horkheimer and Adorno's gloomy prognosis that modernity's pursuit of autonomy could lead to the annihilation of the social conditions for a well-lived life. Moreover, he sees the concept of autonomous agency as inseparable from an emphasis on self-control. He insists, or his counterposition here is that people frequently feel the least alienated or the most at home with themselves precisely when they lose control over themselves, their lives, or their circumstances. So for these reasons, he proposes a concept of freedom that breaks with any connotation of self-legislation or self-direction or self-determination. What he calls, by contrast, resonant self-efficacious subjectivity is a process and response-oriented relationship to the world that is constitutively reliant on that which remains forever inaccessible, which cannot be mastered, which resists. He's confident that this concept of resonant self-efficacy fully captures the meaning of freedom in the sense of a non-alienated relationship to the world, while avoiding the unwelcome connotations of the concept of autonomy and other compensators such as authenticity or integrity. He concedes that autonomy could be seen as a prerequisite for non-alienated subjectivity. But even here, however, he's cautious. While it can be, as he says, it can be an important enabling condition for establishing resonant relationships to the world, he doesn't think autonomy or self-determination is strictly necessary. The subject, to use a metaphor, may be able to vibrate at the precise frequency that corresponds to its own voice, even in the absence of options and opportunities for self-determination. But I don't agree with Rosa that freedom should be re-envisioned as resonant self-efficacy. I think he jumps too hastily from the thesis, the correct thesis of the relationality of the self, to a rejection of any concept of freedom as self-determination. Politically, his rejection of the idea of self-determination and the sidelining of critical reflection that results from this rejection has quietist implications. More specifically, it inhibits critique of certain kinds of power. An example here is power as authoritarianism, a power relationship that generally has been seen as detrimental to freedom within the broad tradition of critical social theory. In the absence of critical reflection as an integral element of freedom, Rosa's self-efficacious subjects have no freedom-related motivation to interrogate and challenge authoritarian power and have no normative basis for doing so. Political authoritarianism is closely connected with what I've called theoretical authoritarianism. This has an epistemological and ethical aspect. Political authoritarianism is a mode of authority based on a claim always to know best what is factually or normatively correct. Its power resides in this superior knowledge, which typically rests on a claim to privileged access to truth. In consequence, authoritarian authorities' claim to knowledge cannot be challenged by those concerned. Ethical authoritarianism is closely related to this. It's a mode of authority based on claim to insight into what is good in an ethical sense that cannot be challenged rationally by those over whom it's exercised. Authoritarian authority is hostile to strongly evaluation agency, as I have interpreted, because it compels its subjects to accept unquestionably certain ways of thinking and acting, disallowing the kind of critical reflection that's a condition of their self-determined freedom. But by contrast, it's not evidently hostile to self-efficacious agency as construed by Rosa. Indeed, authoritarian regimes may be particularly well equipped to provide the material basis that Rosa considers necessary for the development of this kind of agency. By material basis, he means, for example, technological and economic efficiency, which makes it possible to cure diseases and overcome material shortages, thereby creating the conditions necessary to dream of resonant relationships to the world for everybody. As a matter of empirical fact, however, authoritarian regimes may be better able than non-authoritarian ones to ensure the required material basis for everyone. Thus, not only do self-efficacious subjects have no normative basis for rejecting authoritarianism, they might well have good material reasons for embracing it. And that's why I think Rosa should re-articulate his idea of resonant self-efficacious subjectivity as a mode of agency in which self-determination is an integral element, and he should use this as the basis for an account of non-authoritarian authority. So I have about 2 more pages where I was going to say a little bit about idleness, but if you feel it's going on too long, I could just skip it and move to the end.
I think we have time.
Okay, thank you. Well, I won't take too long here.
Good.
But it's my purpose here is really to try and give you a sense of how my incipient efforts to reimagine freedom as a mode of ecologically attuned, ethically self-determining, self-transforming agency is, despite evident overlaps, is different from resonant subjectivity as imagined by Rosa, and it's also different to idleness as imagined by my colleague Brian O'Connor, and I highly recommend both Rosa's and O'Connor's books. So in particular, Brian O'Connor's philosophical essay, Idleness, published I think 2018 by Princeton University Press, it contrasting what I envisioned with his view of freedom as idleness, helps to show why I place so much importance on self-transformation in my conception of agency. So Rosa is important from the point of view of self-direction. O'Connor is important from the point of view of self-transformation. So like Rosa's, O'Connor's conception is particularly interesting from the point of view of my own proposal, because at first glance, it too could be described as ecologically attuned. As in the case of Rosa, O'Connor and I share a critical gaze on instrumentalizing and controlling human agency. However, I want to argue that, given the short version here, that O'Connor's perspective is not, in fact, ecologically attuned, and that in addition, like Rosa's, it lacks any robust political dimension. In O'Connor's case, this is because it rejects the value of self-transformation and, by extension, social transformation. O'Connor offers a defense of idleness that is at once a critique of the negative perceptions of idleness found in the writings of many modern philosophers and a positive vision of human freedom. Against the widespread philosophical view that a life of idleness is a debased form of life, O'Connor presents idleness as, he writes, a bolder image of freedom. In contrast with Rosa, it's noteworthy that he characterizes idleness as a form of self-direction. Idleness for O'Connor is not a life of mere impulse. This means in turn that it's not mindless. It contains conceptual components and judgments. However, though we know what we're doing when we idle, we have no overall end or purpose in what we do. This lack of overall end or purpose explains why idleness has no connection with any ethical doctrines or systems, for it implies a profound indifference to the good of others. Nonetheless, idleness can be said, and O'Connor acknowledges this, can be said to have an ethical dimension, in that a life of idleness inevitably has a sense, carries with it a sense that such a life is a good life for the idler. O'Connor emphasizes the oppositional nature both of his conceptualization of idleness as a form of freedom and of the concept of let's say, sorry, I've left out something here. Let's just say he emphasizes the oppositional nature of his idea of idleness. Idleness is oppositional in the sense that it opposes prevailing social conventions and resists norms and conventions of societies like ours. To be sure, its resistance is implicit. In O'Connor's account, moreover, its rebellion is not against any and every kind of norm and convention, but is far more specific. It's a defiance of the norms and conventions of modern capitalist societies. Idleness resists the expectations incorporated in the institutions and practices of such societies. Above all, it resists the expectation that social standing is to be acquired through productivity and performance, through hard work, discipline, self-improvement, and self-control. In this respect, there's a clear affinity between his imagining of freedom as idleness, mine, and Rosa's. motivating all three of us is a rejection of freedom as sovereign power over self and others, together with the attitude of self-mastery control that this modern ideal of freedom expresses. Put differently, both O'Connor and I re-envision human freedom as a mode of self-direction that is non-instrumental. Another point of connection, as I mentioned, is that we both attribute an ethical dimension to freedom in the sense that we tie it to a sense of the good. But crucially, we part ways in how we unpack this sense of the good. In O'Connor's case, the connection between freedom and the good means only that a life of idleness is experienced as and held to be by the idler a good life. Freedom as idleness, as I said, rules out any concern for the good of others, human or non-human. This means, in turn, that it is essentially indifferent to the question of whether others lead a good life, indeed, even to the question of whether they should lead a life of idleness. And this is why I think O'Connor is correct to say that it has no connection, idleness has no connection with any ethical system or doctrine. But a troubling implication of this, from the point of view of the contemporary ecological disaster, is that freedom as idleness is essentially indifferent to the good of others, humans and non-humans. For this reason, despite its radical non-instrumentality, it is not what I call ecologically attuned. Nor is it robustly political, in the sense of motivated by concern for the quality of social arrangements and possibilities for change for the better. Put differently, it lacks the transformative element that I built into freedom. O'Connor emphasizes that freedom as idleness is a fundamentally non-developmental perspective on agency. Idleness is antithetical to any kind of necessity, including higher necessities such as self-realization. This explains why it's a form of agency that is completely indifferent towards what we ought to make of ourselves. Also why it resists the view that our lives should take on a certain shape or clear purpose. Ultimately, it explains why freedom as idleness is fundamentally incompatible with a desire to change oneself for the better. This means, of course, that it's profoundly hostile to Taylor's idea of the modern self as a strong evaluator. In consequence, freedom as idleness is fundamentally incompatible with a desire to change society for the better. Thus, while freedom as idleness is a rebellious mode of freedom, and in this sense politically motivated, I reject it as a re-envisioning of freedom appropriate for humans in our times of ecological disaster. So my very final remarks will be on the power of critically engaged socio-political theorizing. So I attribute to critical theory in the broadest sense, critically engaged socio-political theorizing, and non-authoritarian transformative force. And this transformative force resides in its capacity for disclosure. Qua disclosure, it's an invitation to see, think, and behave differently. Qua invitation, rather than command, it's inherently non-authoritarian. And once again, I find Adorno's writings helpful in trying to make sense of this idea of the transformative power of critical social theorizing. To be sure, this transformative disclosive power of critical theorizing is rarely thematized explicitly in Adorno's writings. Rather, it's manifested in them. For instance, when he uses a wide range of rhetorical strategies to drive home his philosophical theses. This is particularly striking in Dialectic Enlightenment, but it's also evident in Adorno's later work, where he employs linguistic resources such as condensing or shifting meanings, suggestive metaphors, and narrative presentations in order to disclose pathologies of social reality that hitherto have been unperceived or obscured. It seems to me fruitful, in the context of my project, to further elaborate this Adornian model of non-authoritarian, transformative, critically engaged theorizing to, among other things, to comparison and contrast with the disclosive power of critically engaged political oratory. An excellent example here is Martin Luther King's public speeches and letters in his campaign of civil disobedience protesting against the existing social order. These display a highly developed talent for what we call civil translation, a practice that employs the semantic codes dominant in the existing social order to create narratives that make it possible for the majority to identify with the grievances of the protesters. Pache, the sociologist Jeffrey Alexander, who in fact, I think, coined this term civil translation, I think that closer examination of the practice of civil translation, King in particular, shows that it's not just a mediating activity, not just a question of building bridges between discourses and vocabularies that seem very far apart. In addition, civil translation has a disclosive force. It contains the potential to enable people to perceive suffering that they had previously not recognized as such. And it seems to me that in our times of ecological disaster, that critical theory should reaffirm this disclosive potential and highlight it as a core task of any critically engaged mode of reflection on society. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Maeve. We're going to have Marty J. Come to the table and give a response. While he's coming, I want to remember to thank and thank again and again our incredible staff who run everything and are here behind the scenes making everything happen. Simon Brown, Hannah Hart, Patty Dunlap. Also, those of you looking in person at the screen and those of you in the Zoom world itself are seeing two of our other invaluable team, Kai Nguyen and Dan Blanton, neither of whom could be here in person with us. Dan, in his inimitable manner, moved heaven and earth to make this event happen after our semester had already ended. So many thanks to him, and thanks to Kai for making us know what we're able to do and what we can stretch and how we can possibly pull things off financially that look like they couldn't be otherwise done. Thanks to our staff. Marty, thank you for being here and for responding.
Thanks, Rob. It's a great pleasure to respond to Maeve, whose work over the years has meant so much to those of us in the critical theory community. And this paper in particular has, it seems to me, a great deal of importance or resonance, we might say, if we can borrow that from Rosa, in the sense that political theory today can't do business as usual. It can't do yet another study of Hegel's view of the state, or Carl Schmitt's notion of the political, or Hobbes on sovereignty. It has to address the exigent crisis that she so clearly, I think, brings to the fore, which is the crisis of the climate that is collapsing around us, and that political theory has to somehow figure out how to add to our response. It can't do the solving by itself, but it has to at least address it. So I applaud actually the intention of the paper. Now the question, though, on the table, and this is, I think, the perhaps crux of the issue, is whether or not freedom, human freedom, understood in a variety of ways, negative, positive, all the various ways that Maeve pointed out, human freedom is the crucial link between society and nature, society and the ecological environment, society and something that is non-social, something that is the other of society. And here I must admit to a certain, let's say, skepticism. There have, of course, been many attempts by philosophers, political theorists among them, to think about the, let's say, obligation of humans to the environment. Usually, these have taken the form of what might be called not self-determining, but rather other-regarding positions. And I think of some of the most obvious. The stress on care in Heidegger, care for being, or perhaps care for the world, care as a kind of attitude, which of course has also been picked up by feminists like Carol Gilligan, given a particular gender spin. The idea that humans should nurture, should care, should somehow have a relationship, not of exploitation, but one that shows that they are not self-centered, that their self-determination is less important than the regard they have for others. A second position is the one that perhaps is best identified with Hans Jonas, the idea of responsibility, the idea of the imperative we have to be responsible. And in his case, the responsibility is to future generations, that we are, in a sense, holding on to the earth, not for ourselves, but for our children, for our children's children. And therefore, there is a kind of, once again, other regarding rather than self-determining quality. Now, there have been, of course, pushbacks against the idea that future generations, posterity, should be normative. I think, for example, of the queer theorist Lee Edelman, whose book No Future is an attack on the idea that the children of the future really should be somehow superior to the people of the present. But this is, I would say, a somewhat askew version of response to this. The third, I would say, version of a kind of ethical response is one that we might identify with Emmanuel Levinas. And here's the idea, we might say, of humility, that human beings should be hostage to the other, should be inferior to the other, should take ourselves not as autonomous, but in some ways as obliged. So here too, there's a sense of weakening the idea of self-determination. And these are all ways in which a relation between humans, broadly speaking, and the natural world can be seen as different from one stressing the idea of human freedom, human self-determination, human autonomy. Now, it seems to me that Maeve is not going in that direction, these directions, because of her emphasis on equality, because of her emphasis on non-hierarchical relations. And I think we all, democratically have the instinct to see hierarchy as problematic, especially when it is unearned, when it is hierarchy that means domination, when it's hierarchy that involves subordination that we think of as unjust. There are, however, and this is where it gets complicated, hierarchies in the natural world. The natural world is not, in any obvious sense, egalitarian. There are predators and there's prey. There's a food chain. There's a sense of survival produced by some notion of fitness. In other words, there is struggle. And there's often a hierarchical struggle, not one in which there is egalitarianism. So there is, we might say, a potential for a new version of the domination of nature in an anthropomorphic projection of the ideal of self-determining equality onto a natural world, which is, in a very basic sense, an other, which is not really like us, and therefore cannot be assumed to have moral agency. This seems to be an absolutely crucial issue. Moral agency, however we define it in Kantian terms, the ontological term, lots of various ways we can think of moral agency. Moral agency, in some ways, is extremely hard to perceive in the natural world. If we throw an infant into a cage of Komodo dragons, the Komodo dragons don't have a moment of moral weighing whether or not it's good or bad for the baby to gobble it up. They simply do it. There's no moral agency in an avalanche that sweeps away an innocent skier. So the idea of moral agency is one that once again involves a kind of asymmetry, if not a hierarchy. We have it, at least we hope we do. We have ethical either impulses or habits, or 100 ways to think about our ethical, let's say, obligations. The natural world, it's hard to see where those are. And so the notion, say, of extending human rights, as Peter Singer and others have done to animals, you think of other things like human rights of forests, maybe even of minerals, but to animals, comes up against the problem of reciprocity, that we can be ethically inclined towards animals, but we can't expect animals to have ethical obligations towards us. So there's a kind of basic asymmetry, which comes back to the idea, once again, of care, or what might be in the old, biblical sense of stewardship, that we are here to be the stewards of nature rather than simply part of nature in an absolutely egalitarian sense. And this once again reintroduces hierarchy. So I would, in a way, want to push back against an overly quick extrapolation from the idea of human social freedom in whatever form, to the idea that this can be extended through ecological attunement to the larger world, including the natural world. Something else, some other relation has to be thought through. The final point I would make has to do with the issue of instrumentality. Now, we have a kind of common Frankfurt School let's say, allergy to the idea of instrumental reason. And the idea that instrumental reason is an impoverished notion of rationality, that there's a higher notion of reason, whether we define it in objective terms, let's say Horkheim, or communicative terms, in Habermas sense. Instrumental reason is somehow inherently problematic. It seems to me we go too far, however, to create a kind of instrumental reason bad, non-instrumental reason good, simply because to be human, and you talk at one point, I think, about a version of human nature, which the Anthropocene falls back at. To be human is basically to use tools. And I can't think of any definition of the human that could somehow escape that truth. That Homo faber is man the tool maker, whether or not language is a tool, certainly all the various things that allow us to survive in a world in which we're instinctually basically impoverished, as Gail and other pointed out, where we are mango-based. We need tools, we need supplements. So instrumentality, instrumentalization, tool making is inherent in the human condition, and we cannot, I think, simply live in a non-instrumental relationship with the natural world. We have to use tools, whether or not they be benign ones, like, say, I don't know, windmills that give us energy, or fracking, which is not so nice. We need tools. So then the question really is, why is instrumentality, or instrumental reason rather, problematic? It seems to me there's three ways to conceptualize that. One is to see it in terms of its proper domain and its colonization of other areas. Kind of Habermasian notion. We have instrumental reason over here, and then we have communicative interaction, symbolic media interaction over here. We treat people in the latter as ends, or as interlocutors, or as subjects. Here we treat them as objects. So it's perhaps problematic to treat people as we treat the natural world, where we mining or whatever. People need to be understood as fellow human beings in a kind of reciprocal way, and therefore instrumentality is not bad in itself, but when it colonizes the rest of the world. The second problem with instrumental reason is its inadvertent consequences, so that we intend something using a particular means, and then it produces something that we don't intend. So all that plastic that was so helpful, when we needed to drink soda, or water, now is killing the fish. And no one knew 50 years ago when they started this thing, well, plastic, the fish would die. So inadvertent consequences. Now, it's also true, just to sort of bracket this point, that almost all of the human interactions also can have inadvertent consequences. You can have a love relationship and it can have inadvertent consequences. Aesthetics can have it. So everything is potentially inadvertent. But the third, and I think this in a way is the most pressing issue when it comes to instrumental reason. The tools that we create, the tools that are supposedly to serve us, have the potential. We've known this, for a long time. Think of, Frankenstein, or the film by Kubrick, 2001, or just the AI issue that we're raising so much, that's being raised so much today. The tools can become autonomous and control us. And therefore, there's some way in which self-determination becomes heteronymous, and what we've created controls us. So those are the three ways, it seems to me, in which a pathological instrumentalization is deeply problematic. But this can't be resolved by simply being anti-instrumental. Even the indigenous peoples that you raise the kind of model, they use tools. I mean, those bows and arrows were used to kill buffalo. They were not used, to make nice in buffalo. So these are all ways in which I would, push back against the sufficiency of the discourse of freedom to get at what I think is a very laudable goal, which is an ecologically attuned notion of political theory and political action, which is really what we hope will come out of this. So I'll stop there and
Thank you very much.
respond.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Rob, and thank you, Marty. So, of course, as I did expect, very insightful, beautifully structured, complex response. I am anxious to hear what other people think, so I don't have very much to say, because with regard to the three parts of your response, I found them the first part really very helpful, that these the reminder of these various other approaches to other I'm not necessarily alternatives to freedom, but certainly alternative models of agency in which the other, regard for the other is stressed rather than regard for the self, such as Gilligan's ethics of care, or Jonas's ethics of responsibility, or Levinas's ethics of humility. So I just found that very, very, very helpful. The key issue is, I think, is your second point, so I'll come to that in a minute. The reason why the third one on instrumentality isn't such an issue for me, I just find it really, really helpful what you said, is because I agree with you. In fact, the only, I think so far, the only article I've published which explicitly is on the topic of agency in the Anthropocene was an even earlier, at an even earlier stage of my project 2 or 3 years ago, where I make exactly that point. Instrumentality on its own isn't the problem. There are, yeah, and I think, I don't know why Horkham simply polemical there, but I thought your three, you raised the question of what is then bad instrumentality. I thought the proposals you make are really very helpful. So in case I forget afterwards, I hope you can remind me of it, because it just very helpful differentiations. But I completely agree with that. And but in a way, this is in saying that we need a more differentiated perspective on instrumentality. This brings you back to the second part of Marty's presentation, which was questioning this non-hierarchical aspect of my proposed reconceptualization of agency, which in turn raises the question of why freedom at all. So I'll come back to why freedom at all in a few minutes. But I mean, what at least my intuition is that that certain kinds of hierarchy are worrying, just certain kinds of instrumentality are worrying. So I'm very insistent that the kind of non-hierarchical relationships I'm trying to imagine between humans and non-humans are ethically non-hierarchical, and I mean that in a quite specific sense. So I don't in any way dispute that there are hierarchical relationships, and they can be on both sides. I mean, and there are also back to anthropocentrism in a minute. There are also various kinds of anthropocentrism that are just some are more pernicious than others, but certainly some kinds of hierarchy are inevitable. Some I don't regard as particularly disturbing. What I mean by, to say it again, but this is it's difficult even for me to know exactly what I imagine here. When I talk of ethically non-hierarchical relationships, is that a relationship where we as humans relate to others, humans and non-humans, as some kinds of, each entity is, if you like, a depository of the good. So it's a kind of a cosmological vision, if you like, a depository of the good, which doesn't in itself determine how we should relate to the others, to any other in a concrete way. It doesn't rule out eating animals, for example, or it doesn't, but it means we would eat animals in a different way, because we would see them. This is maybe maybe it's my fantasy of indigenous thinking, but and many other forms of non-Western, let's say indigenous thinking, is that we would seeing the other as what I'm now calling a depository of the good, means that we would relate to the other in a different way. And I think it could be meaningfully described as an ethically non-hierarchical way, because we do not presuppose from the get-go that we as humans have have a monopoly on the good, if you like. The good is, that's why it's so important for my conception that the good doesn't have its source in human interest or concern. It's not a human construct in any sense. It has a radical transcendence of the human, because without that, I don't think it makes sense to think of ethically non-hierarchical relationships with others. Now, that's my starting point. Where we go from there, I don't know. But it's certainly, I'm certainly not saying we're all, there are no hierarchies, and there won't be any hierarchies.
Can I make just
Yeah,
one
of course,
point?
yeah.
Wonderful, sort of threads pull. The idea of the good being somehow suffusing creation, that the good is somehow suprahuman, includes nature, which has a kind of, let's say, inherent end in itself quality. This is I would say, traditional notion of a certain version of the cosmos as inherently harmonistic, as inherently rational, creation, in other words, as the creation of a benevolent God, which in its more absurd forms, Leibnizian notions of this being best of all possible worlds. There is a pushback against that, which is to say, no, the world is a far more heterogeneous, a far more complex mixture of various kinds of goods. And I think in the paper, one would say that there is a plurality of goods. And therefore, what's good for the coronavirus is not good for us. And there's no way in which we can find a kind of common ground, that there are ways in which we struggle against the good that some other entity in the world, or in the cosmos even, might find inherent in its own being, its own telos. So that I would say there is always a kind of choice, or always a kind of what's called hierarchy, in which various goods, and even the idea of human good, I mean, this is a clearly historically fraught issue, because various groups in society have decided they know what's good for humanity. For example, eugenics movement. So, the good is always a contested territory, it seems to me. And I think that has to be taken into account when we try to expand our notion of the good beyond what you might call species-centric notions of simple human survival. That there's something else that we should include, but it's not clear how, it's not clear which versions of that we should approve of, which versions we should contest. So I think that complicates the argument. Does away with it, but I think it's important to keep that in mind.
That's very challenging and very important for me to think more about. I don't have a satisfactory answer to it. But once again, I want to say that where I want to go, or what I want to explore, is whether some kind of cosmological thinking, which is absolutely, is part of the project, as you absolutely rightly say, whether this necessarily will entail the kind of harmonistic vision of a benevolent, benevolent God or benevolent cosmos that it has often carried with it. So I don't. It seems to me it doesn't necessarily, but I don't know. And if it did, it would be not good for where I want to go, because I apart from anything, but not apart from anything, it's very important to my idea of the good that we always look at the good from our perspective of the good. And this, of course, is a human perspective, and there's no single human perspective that is the right perspective. So my model of my idea of evaluation of good is an agonistic model, and it's inevitably anthropocentric as well. We can't escape the human. There will always be our interpretations of the good are always human interpretations. Nonetheless, it seems to me to make a difference if we think of the good as having nonetheless some kind of truth, or the good as having some kind of independence of our evaluations of it or our perspectives on it. But I genuinely don't know. I don't know enough about it. I don't have any history of research into or thinking about thinking in cosmological terms. Yeah.
Let me add one
Yeah.
quick footnote to that. The idea of ecological balance, the idea of restoring some sort of equilibrium, is a very powerful motor of what you call ecological attunement. The idea that somehow we're out of balance, we're out of whack, and we have to go back to balance. Now, this sounds almost self-evidently true. However, there are interesting counterexamples. One in particular comes from Nazi horticultural practice, which I once wrote about years ago. The Nazis had a notion of plants being indigenous to a particular landscape. And that landscape also had people who were rooted in that landscape. And there was a sense that both humans from other tribes, as it were, and also foreign invading plants were like aliens who needed to be cast out. And what needed to be restored was some notion of balance, equilibrium, of a primary or prior notion of what should be there as opposed to what intruded. So in a weird way, even the notion of ecological balance, even the notion of ecological equilibrium can be turned to nefarious purposes when it means getting rid of the aliens, getting rid of the invaders, getting rid of the others, getting rid of the people who don't belong, plants which don't belong in this particular landscape. So in other words, it opens up incredibly fraught issues which are historical rather than just radical. So
Overwhelmingly difficult issues, and that's really fascinating. I must read what you've written about this, and it doesn't surprise me. I mean, it wouldn't have. In some ways, it does that the Nazi to hear this about Nazi horticulture practice, but as the way you presented it, it fits well, and I can see, yeah, that is definitely a danger. But whether it's when it inevitably goes that way, one has to guard against these dangers. Just that's what I would say there. Maybe I don't have much more to say except maybe to say again, because what you're really pushing back against is well, I don't know if you are, but what you certainly in your response pushed me to say to defend was why freedom at all? Why not some other? If I'm so keen on certain forms of relationality and particularly other regarding relations, care, humility, and so on, why freedom? And I only have well, I don't have any more to say than the two things that I say in my talk. First of all, one is a bit more contextual. One is that I don't think this is a good point in history to give up on the discourse on freedom, precisely because it's abused in so many ways, and the danger is that if you deny people the vocabulary of freedom, then they just become belligerent in various ways. I want to, I don't think it makes people feel powerless, and then they feel, if you deny them the vocabulary of freedom, makes them feel even more powerless, and then they react in destructive ways. But the more important reason is that I can't see how one can change society for the better without critical reflection, coupled with a perceived, with a perception that humans collectively or individually, through their actions and thinking, can change society for the better. We need critical reflection and some sort of view of that the praxis can change the world. And I don't see, and that's what I really mean by the self-determining, self-directing component of freedom. I don't see any inevitable tension between that and the kind of relationality with others that I'm envisaging. But maybe there is. Maybe there will come a point where I have to say no, we have to give up on it. But at the moment, I don't think so.
Thank you both. The first person that I think I see on the Zoom asking a question is Manuela Santa Maria. If you have a question, it looks like your hand is up. Please feel free to unmute yourself and ask the question. Thank you.
Thank you. I think Pablo Gilabert was first, so I think it would be unfair if I
No
do
worries,
it
Manuela.
first.
Go, Manuela. I will talk later. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, thank you first of all for the presentation and for the interventions. They were really interesting. I wanted to ask, because I see for you, Professor, authoritarianism is a great concern. But I think my question goes in this way, because capitalism is also authoritarian, and we've seen, this madness in the. I mean, is inherent to its nature, but is getting worse every time. So I'm wondering, and it reminds me of this famous quote by Horkheimer, which says, "Who wants to be silent about capitalism should be also silent about fascism." And so I was thinking, because it's really interesting, this perspective, but how can we avoid this depoliticization, in the sense that activism, environmental activism, is extremely risky, particularly in the United States by the criminalization of activism, and in Latin America by the physical threat of annihilation. I was wondering how your perspective could help a politicization, a collective politicization that would also face the authoritarian nature of capitalism. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Manuela. I don't think I can say very much that will be helpful, except to broadly agree with you that capitalism and authoritarianism are major problems in most societies at this point in history. Also, that they overlap, they intersect, let's say, in multiple and complex ways. So I certainly agree with that. That activism against authoritarianism and capitalism is extremely dangerous. I agree with that too. I don't have any recipes, but I think many of us, nobody really knows what we can do. But what I want to say is we should still. Well, we should think of. We should not give up. I mean, political. But how we act individually and collectively to bring about the kind of change for the better that we think is necessary is highly contextual. I mean, what's possible in one context won't be possible in another. I will reiterate my point is that it can be very piecemeal. It can be we mightn't see connections between various kinds of action and the the more broader social change that can result from it. In that sense, it can also be incremental. But I don't have any advice really, except don't give up. Don't give up.
Marty, any advice?
It's too late.
I wonder if there's anyone. Yes, please.
I was recently rereading Karl, the manuscripts on Karl Marx's work on alienation. And it struck me for the first time how it describes alienation, the alienated individual. And that's kind of misleading when you look at Marx's early writings, because actually he not only means to say that human beings, the species activity of human beings is characterized by the fact that we not only work with each other, but we work for each other, that our labor is for the benefit of other people. And I think that's the framework within which he conceives the dialectic, if you will, of autonomy and heteronomy. And it seems to me that that a liberal conception of freedom, defined by Hobbes and Locke as the absence of impediment, sort of locates everything outside of the individual's appetites and aversions as the realm of heteronomy. But there is another conception of freedom pioneered by Rousseau, where freedom is the obedience to a self-given law and is a foundation of a form of freedom that exists in individuals, but mostly in relationships between individuals. And for Marx, freedom culminates in the freely associated individuals, which include free individuals. But the notion that human association can be a source of freedom, and that autonomy and heteronomy can be reconceived in terms of those types of human associations that are heteronomous and those types of human associations that are autonomous, is I think what's going on with Marx, in contrast to liberal freedom, which includes domination of nature and so on and so forth, the facilitation of the well-being of the individual. I guess I say this because my perspective, I don't see the sociology in this. I don't see how we get from a notion of freely associated individuals. And I think you can upgrade that to say that the freedom of association evolves in a context, I kind of agree with Marty here, a context of communicatively regulated material activity. That I think is how Marx ends up conceiving of human labor. And yet that institutionally organizes itself in forms of historically produced institutional orders that are the main obstacle to #1 transformation of our species activity, which I think is kind of another word in Marx for what Darwin later calls adaptation. And also paralleling that transformation, our ability to make decisions collectively and freely and autonomously as citizens to facilitate that kind of adaptation to our natural environment. I guess in that sense too, I kind of do want to see freedom as something that has to do with relationships between members of the human species, and without suggesting that we need to sort of be indifferent to or dominate other species or our physical environment. That freedom is a quality, and morality is a quality that provides a certain amount of intelligibility to our community regulated material activities. And so there's a large structure of domination, of unfreedom within the social sphere, within the species, that is, I think you correctly connect to the possibilities of adapting as a species to our environment. It's something that stands in the way of that form of adaptation. But I think we need to sort of conceive of free association, and particularly in the political realm, as one of the paths to, because you also correctly suggest authoritarianism is much better equipped if it ever takes its mind to adapt to our environment than democracy. Democracy is conceived of as nothing more than just people arguing. I mean,
Perhaps this might give the two of you some chance to elaborate in response to the question, or any thoughts or responses that you might have.
Well, I think what comes out very clearly from what you've said, and is something that has always, it has been very important for my own thinking about autonomy, particular freedom more generally over the last many years, and it remains a question for me. What you presented very clearly was this question of it. What is the connection between the individual and the collective? Why does freedom involve both moments? Why do we need why do we only have it in association with others? And you mentioned, you talked about both Rousseau and Marx, and in both cases, and particularly Rousseau, and I always found this intuition that we are truly free only in society very powerful, but it's really hard to make sense of it, to say why exactly that is. And Rousseau doesn't, I don't find his answer, he gives an answer, I don't find it convincing, or I find it too problematic in various ways. And Marx, I think, doesn't really answer the question either, but he has his intuition. So I've been trying to make sense of this for a long time, and I do it in terms of strong evaluation and critical evaluation. You need each other as an agonistic models of critical evaluation of the good and so on. I'm not entirely convinced by my own efforts, but I think the intuition is correct. And I don't see it as being, but what I don't see is why association with others should only be human others. I can see why human others have to be part of it, but I don't see why, if we say that freedom is a mode of agency that we develop only associatively for reasons that I don't think I have, not for myself at least, convincingly identified, but I'm trying to, why that should be restricted to human others. So I don't want to say not also human others, but I'm not sure.
I mean, the issue of the self, who's doing the determining, is obviously central. So one can argue that there is, let's say, an overly spiritualized, overly rational notion of the self in certain traditions of self-governance, self-determination, which fails to honor the other in the self, the animal in the human, the natural in the historical. Now, one can go too far in that direction and end up with all kinds of ideological or mythical notions of human nature, but there still is some complicated way. Derrida and other people have talked about our animality is a crucial thing that we've in a way forgotten, which then links us back to that natural world. So it's not so much through our ability to be fully determining or fully autonomous, but rather our empathetic relationship to a world of suffering. Because animals have not the ability to reason necessarily, though many do, but they all presumably have the capacity to suffer. So there's an empathetic embrace, we might say, an empathetic widening of the circle of the self, which would then not proceed by defining the self in terms of autonomy or freedom, but rather through corporeal empathy, through suffering and maybe also pleasure, that allows us to see ourselves as more than just spiritualized persons in a kind of Kantian moral sense, totally outside the world of natural causality. So that's one way to sort of, I think, enlarge the sense of how we are situated in more than just the island of humanness, the island or self-regard.
Well, I'm certainly very more than sympathetic to that. I think that's an indispensable component of thinking about the self, what you call the animality or the materiality, in the sense of the nature within us, as Horkheimer and Adorno would say. But I mean, some version, I mean, Freud, couples attention to the animality within us with the ego and self-direction, and I don't see any inevitable conflict between self-direction and remembrance, as Horkheimer talked in the first chapter of Dialectic of Enlightenment, remembrance or recalling of nature within us. Whatever, that's I find it a very difficult thought, I have to say, in their writings, but something like that. Let's say just animality or connection with I mean, Nietzsche, of course, as well, and there's a kind of self-direction in Nietzsche, like there is in the later Foucault, sort of the creation of the self through as an aesthetic activity is a kind of self-direction as well. So these are different ways of thinking about self-direction and in its relationship to our animal selves.
I think that Pablo Filaver had a question, and this also gives us a chance to just say thank you, Pablo, for coming in from Montreal. And
I wish I were there myself as well. Anyway, so thank you, Maeve, for the great talk. I have a question about the relation between the right. So in your view, can the right and the good ever conflict? And when they do, does the right have priority? More specifically, and regarding the topic of your talk, could it ever be that for a particular individual, having a non-hierarchical or ecologically attuned attitude is not high up in terms of their good? If that were to be possible, and let's assume for a moment that it could, wouldn't it be important to say that the right nevertheless requires that this individual has an ecologically attuned and non-hierarchical attitude? So could there be a conflict between the good and the right? And if the good of an individual doesn't go along the lines that you prefer, would you say that the right requires nonetheless that those attitudes be in place? Or would you solve this conflict by saying that you have some objectivist, perfectionist view of the good, such that these attitudes that are problematic will never be in tune with the good? It would never be tracking the good properly understood. I hope the question is clear. Thank you very much for the talk, Maeve. It was great.
Thank you. Thank you, Pablo. I think I would say that I don't see any conflict between the right and the good, because I see I see the scenario you presented us with as a conflict between conceptions of the good. And there can certainly be conflicts between conceptions of the good. And I think they have to be, if you like, fought out in the public sphere. I mean, that's why I have an agonistic model of reasoning about the good. But I don't have any place for a moral principle, if you like, or something called the right that is above the good. The good is. So in this respect, I don't really. In this respect, in fact, probably in just about every respect, I don't find it helpful to distinguish between morality and ethics, if you like, or between the right and the good. I think there is just the good. So if I feel, passionately, and I think I have good arguments to say why the good, we should adopt an ecologically attuned perspective on the good, and you think otherwise, then we have to try and convince each other, and in the process of trying to convince one another, we might move to a quite different position. So I have a processual model of public reasoning, which is reasoning about the good, and it involves conflict and justifications, but justifications in the broader sense of Iris Marion Young was particularly good at this, narratives, stories, but we try and convince other people, and then we also maybe move on in our own thinking in the process.
is there perhaps another question in person audience? Please, in the back.
Hi, I'm Elias. Thank you so much for speaking. I just graduated from Berkeley in sociology, so I'm just doing a program about something I'm interested in. I was really excited about your talk, and I'm mainly curious about thinking through civil translation and recognition of suffering. I thought that final point you kind of made it seems, to me at least, a form of ecological disasters, recognizing the suffering of individuals on lands in which disaster takes place, and understanding and then enabling that recognition to transfer into the fields or grids of intelligibility for others and other political subjects, political people, political groups in varying regions, because it is a collective effort, but that interdiction of recognition seems to be the problem. It's facilitated by these notions of alien or invasion or abjection generally that apply to both the natural world and also those human subhumans that aren't animals per se, but exist along a continuum of humanity that is curious, I guess, this like ethical hierarchy, how does, I would really like to know how they function in this kind of like, I don't know what to call it, but a spectral justification and determination about the abject when it comes to both the natural and human, and human both impose upon the natural and then facilitates ecological disasters that we see more often than not in the local south and regions where in which there are these great floods, these famines, all of this stuff. I'm curious about what both of your takes would be on that. If that made sense, and if that was fair.
It was very complex. I think there are a lot of strands. It made sense, but I'm trying to see how I can respond in any helpful way, because principally I see, as far as I think I understood you, and I think I got the gist of what you were saying. It seems to me, I'm in agreement with you that these are challenging questions that we have to try and address. But you were asking me something more. So you started off by saying this idea of civil translation, to begin with, and then you moved into and I would go this way too. Civil translation is important because what's at issue here is a way of building bridges between seemingly very different perspectives on the world, different languages, different vocabularies, also opening up new ways of articulating our differences and our similarities, also our relationships to the world. What I thought you were also asking, I think that's exactly what I have in mind when I talk about about something like civil translation and its disclosive force. But I thought you were also asking something about the anthropocentric perspective of justification, and we're talking about this, and the entities to which we're relating aren't themselves speaking. I wasn't sure if you were asking that, but it seems to me.
Oh, I'm sorry.
You weren't, yeah. That's very challenging. But
I do think maybe in a small sense, I think I was very, very curious about, I guess, the disclosive force, and also like what the form of it and shape of it in this practice or way of thinking or operationalizing this ethical hierarchy in relation to the ecological disaster. What does that practice look like as a tool that people, or I guess in greater theoretical political senses, can then employ, I guess, to resolve the interdiction in recognition that seems to be very vast when it comes to the ecological disaster, that relies on certain notions of relationship or understanding of freedom as associated, but then who can associate it with someone's freedom is particular and also justified. If that makes sense.
Yeah, I think it does make sense, and I think you're also asking about disclosure as a practice, and not just a theoretical practice, but how it actually what happens when and what this would entail concretely in one's relationship to others, not just on an intellectual level, but in one's practices. So I think that's right. It would be important to explore what that means. I think it would certainly, it's certainly the kind of disclosure that I haven't really thought about this, but it would involve practices of ethically non-hierarchical relationality. But those practices can be multiple. I mean, theory is one form of practice in the sense I've used it, but their political action is also, to come back to Manuela's point, is itself can be a disclosive practice in that way. Precisely because people, I mean, we have many examples recently of political movements that try to protest in different ways and to try to embody ethics of of non-hierarchical ethics, and there are also, you know, just unorthodox practices that at the margins of society that have a kind of a exemplary force. So I think there are aesthetic practices in a much more traditional sense that can really help us to perceive the world in non-hierarchical ways. So I think there are multiple ways in which practices can be disclosive and can in a non-hierarchical way.
Mark, did you want to say?
Not
anything?
really, no,
We've actually run well over time. I wanted to say too that there seem to be perhaps one or two more questions in the chat. Please feel free, if you have one, to email it to me. You'll find it on the Program in Critical Theory website at UC Berkeley. I'm Robert Kaufman. Just find me there and I will convey it to Maeve and Marty. And if they, by some miracle, have some time, we can get them back to you. And the same for those in the room, please. And we may have a little time for milling around as well right after. I want to thank very, very much Maeve and Marty again. And I also want to thank in the Zoom world, Kai Nguyen and Dan Blanton of the Program Critical Theory, and here Hannah and Patty and Simon, more than we can possibly say. Thanks to everybody. Take good care, and we hope to see you in person and in the Zoom world soon. Bye-bye. Thank you again.
Thank you very much.